This is Tokens. I'm Lee C. Camp. Hello, friends. Today, my conversation is with Dr. Willie James Jennings, Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale University. We discuss his book, The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race. His book challenged me to deeply rethink how I understand certain things about race, religion, and the American project. Near the middle of the interview, this happened. As a Christian white man raised in the South, who for a long time has been seeking to disentangle myself from various forms of racism and the like, I think in my uninformed ways of looking at some of the most grotesque examples of that, like in the KKK. So when the KKK shows up and you've got a cross, I think in my uninformed way, what I wanted to say was, oh, no, they're just abusing, they're trying to co-opt religious symbols to propagate racism. But what I hear you saying is that, no, that's a completely insufficient understanding of what's going on there. That instead what's going on is that by the time you get to the KKK, 450 years of Christian history has been cultivating this sort of way of looking at the world, and that it's a very long, deeply wed, problematic imagination.
Well, that's exactly right. And this is why for so many people, if we look at the actual trajectory, the historical trajectory that America is formed inside of, then the truth of the matter is if we want to be true to that trajectory, then the KKK, white supremacists, they are actually true to that trajectory. And that's the painful thing for so many people.
It is.
To get their minds around.
Please join me in trying to get our minds around this. Welcome to this special interview with Dr. Willie James Jennings on his book, The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race. We began with some clarifications about imagination. First, I'd like to kind of raise the issue of imagination itself. Mm-hmm. Imagination, I think, so often has been kind of seen as a childish thing, mm-hmm. But you're pointing to the ways in which imagination is a very adult thing, mm-hmm. Even potentially demonic, imperialistic, because mm-hmm. imagination creates realities and creates the structure of the way we organize the whole of the world. You remind us, that the prime meridian is a fictive claim, right? Running there through England, but it is a fictive reality that has projected our whole sense of space of the whole globe, right?
Right.
So that imagination is a very powerful thing. So tell us a little bit more about kind of how you've thought about cultivating imagination.
You captured it nicely there. It is as I like to say, imagination is the womb within which reality comes to be. Mm. And so much of what we understand about race and the racial condition, as it's called, grows out of imaginative work. It grows out of the imaginative work of Christians, Proto-European Christians, if you will. But Christians who, as they looked at the world, trying to make sense of the world, they connected the dots between what they knew and what they didn't understand with their imaginations.
Oh yeah.
And it's that connecting that was so problematic. We all connect, but the thing that helps us not connect in ways that are harmful is normally we listen to other people. And they help us. And that's not what that is. But these colonialists who came to the New Worlds from the 15th century forward, they connected dots without the voice, without the wisdom, without the full knowledge, without the proper interaction, reciprocity with so many indigenous peoples. But the imagination is so important for us because in order for us to move forward now, especially given the problems of whiteness, is that it's going to take the ability to imagine social life differently and to want to live into that change of social life. And for me, it involves three crucial things. And one, it involves rethinking the very nature of our life as Christians, how our faith formed inside the story of another people, and coming to a richer understanding, a richer knowledge of that, to fire our imaginations up. That's crucial first. And that reality begins with the recognition that we as Christians have entered the story of another people. And there, from the position of guests, what should open up is our sense of what it means to be Christian. But then it also requires for us a different way of understanding land and the ground and life in place, recognizing that the world itself is communicative and animate, and God calls us into a beautiful reciprocity with plant and animal, and from that starting to imagine connectivity in a deeper, richer way.
Right.
And then third, to see life with other people as fundamental to the calling of a Christian, that the Spirit of God is calling us always to life with others, especially those who we would prefer not to be with, to learn how to yield to the Spirit's urging and nudging and pushing us toward forming life together across every kind of boundary and every kind of border.
Yeah.
A Christian intellectual and Christian is a person who understands that border and boundary do not function for her or him in the same way it functions for other people. And unfortunately for so many, not only do they not recognize any difference between the way boundary and border function, we have been really important progenitors of boundary.
Right. That's
and
exactly.
border.
Yeah. So can I'd like to explore you talking about the 15th century forward colonialists, and I come from a Christian tradition that some would kind of catalog as a sort of American neo-Anabaptist tradition. At least we were in the 19th century. Then we quickly became way too Americanized, I think, in the 20th century. but in the 19th century, we were really interesting because we had the capacity, for example, to critique imperialism, Constantinianism, to critique the sort of conflation of nationalism and Christianity, to critique the militarism and the violence and the war making and so forth. I'll say, though, being raised in that in the 20th century, we had lost all that, and I didn't learn that as a boy in my church. I learned it in seminary in the history of our denomination. And then I was fascinated with our history. And so then I went on to do a lot of work and trying to learn to do the sorts of critiques of nationalism, imperialism, colonialism, and so forth. But I must say, I was, and this I think speaks to precisely your argument in that my own understanding of this was insufficient with regard to the way in which the colonialism was so deeply grounded in construing the world in terms of blackness and whiteness. And I was just really shocked by this and the depth of it. So will you kind of describe for us some of the particularities of the way in which that operated?
This is often a missing piece for people as they think about the rise of nationalism and then later imperialism. And the reality of colonialism, modern colonialism, and the emergence of racial consciousness grow out of a profound Christian mistake. And they grow out of a Christian vision. When the colonialists came to the new worlds, the places we would now call Africa, Latin America, Canada, the Pacific Islands, many other places, the United States. When they came to these places, they came understanding themselves to be there primarily by the providence of God. Mm-hmm. And that God had brought them to these places for two reasons. Reason number one, to cultivate these lands in the ways they should be cultivated, to take them and to steward them properly, to use the language of a Puritan. a New England
Yeah.
Puritan. But the other was to obviously to convert the indigenous peoples, to mature them in the faith. And so the idea of maturing both land and maturing body was crucial to what they understood themselves to be about in the new world. And this was at the hand of God. They are fully inside the providence of God. Now, as a part of coming to the new world, one of the things that we rarely think about is how, and I'm using some language I used earlier, how overwhelmed and how overwhelming all of this was. I mean, Lee, you have to think about what it must have been like for anyone from the old world of Europe to come to any part of the new worlds in these centuries and to see, the majestic Rocky Mountains or the Pacific Ocean or or Virginia, what we now call Virginia, or the mountains of West Virginia, to see all, or Florida or Peru or Mexico, to see this incredible beauty and land beyond what anybody had imagined, and animals, the diversity of which was mind-boggling, and people, the diversity of which was mind-boggling, the diversity of their languages, mind-boggling. And the need to try to make sense of a world that was now unfolding in front of them. A world for which they really had not been prepared to comprehend in its fullness. A part of the work of comprehension involved trying to make sense, to bring into some kind of cognitive order what was in front of them. And part of that work, central to that work, was to try to categorize, to organize the kinds of bodies, the kinds of flesh, the kinds of animals that were in front of them. Now, obviously, in order to do that kind of organizing, anytime one organizes, one has to use oneself as an anchor of the organizational logic.
Speak from what is known
right,
toward what is not known.
That you have to use yourself as the anchor of the organizational logic. So as it happened, the designation of peoples according to body type, according to skin color, according to all their physical characteristics, fell into an organizational schema that had white at one end and black at the other end. Now, the mistake so many people have made as they've looked back at this history, not so much historians, but people looking at what historians have done. Some historians have made this mistake. But this categorization was not simply about people of European descent being white, people of African descent being black. It was a form of categorization. It was a form of organization within which you could fit the entire planet on a scale from fully developed, mature white, all the way to completely underdeveloped black. So
I was completely taken surprised by the scheme that you've laid out in the book, and the remarkable way in which everybody got categorized at some point along.
Everybody got categorized, and here's what we have to remember: the engine that drove this, this is where people often make a mistake. The engine that drives this is not the eternal coherence and logic of the organization itself. What drives it is a vision of providence that God has placed us here to organize. Yeah. And that's what people mess up on. Well, how did they think? Why did they put these people? Why did they put the Asians near these people? Then put these particular Native American white? You're going to hurt yourself trying to understand the organization because you're missing it. But the point is, the organization is being carried out, driven by two profound engines. On the one side, it's the belief in providence that God has sent us, i.e. these Europeans here, to organize, to make sense of this world, and in order to bring it to maturity. And then on the other side, the other engine that's driving it is the need to cope with the absolute, what I call the epistemological density of the new world that is opening before them. Now, that is the womb within which race starts to form. But there's another element that's crucial. In order to do this kind of organizing, the Europeans turned a deaf ear. They turned off their ears to the ways in which indigenous peoples understood themselves and defined themselves and talked about themselves. They talked about themselves always in relationship to the place and to the animals, to the landscape, and to the way of life that constituted their identity. That is, they didn't carry their identities on their bodies without remainder. To understand who they were, you had to understand the animals that they lived in communion with, the animals they ate, and the way in which, as the great Native American theologian Tintinger says, the way they lived in balance, or sought to try to live in balance and reciprocity, and the way in which the land itself was imagined as coexisting with their ancestors. All of that was their identity. But for the European, no, this was land to be taken and cultivated, i.e. made private property. Who you are is what you wear on your body.
Right.
And so the break is there. The break between an identity tied to land with the very body. That break. So that racial identity and private property, modern private property, form together in the new world. So it's these powerful currents flowing together that start to create the racial imagination.
I think as a Christian white man raised in the South, who for a long time has been seeking to disentangle myself from various forms of racism and the like, I think in my uninformed ways of looking at some of the most grotesque examples of that, like in the KKK. So when the KKK shows up and you've got a cross, I think in my uninformed way, what I wanted to say was, oh no, they're just abusing. They're trying to co-opt religious symbols to propagate racism. But what I hear you saying is that no, that's a completely insufficient understanding of what's going on there. That instead, what's going on is that by the time you get to the KKK, 450 years of Christian history has been cultivating this sort of way of looking at the world, and that it's a very long, deeply wed, problematic imagination.
Well, that's exactly right, and this is why for so many people, if we look at the actual trajectory, the historical trajectory that America is formed inside of, then the truth of the matter is, if we want to be true to that trajectory, then the KKK, white supremacists, they are actually true to that trajectory, and that's the painful thing for so many people.
It is
to get their minds around the idea that I have come to take this land and to build a world by building my wealth, by building my voice, by building myself from ownership of this land.
And commodification of black bodies.
Right. Is fundamental to the West. This is why, I always say, anybody who wants to try to address race and refuses to look at the way private property functions will never address race. Because these things are bound together. The control of my space is the control of my body. And if you remember that saying, and you think about what white supremacists saying, you think about what people who we would say on the far right, what they actually say, what you will hear inside whatever they say is exactly what I just said. The control of my body is the control of my space, and the control of my space is the control of my body. And that runs all the way from how they understand the nation itself, to their neighborhoods, to their own physical well-being. And so, for us to challenge it, we who are Christian, we have to first recognize, this is our baby. This is the child we brought into the world. And now that it's full grown and has weapons, we've got to walk up to our child and say, hold on, let me explain to you why you are wrong, because we created you, but this is not right.
I think that in my mind, it's important if people aren't hearing this. I think I would want them to hear this. You ask at one point in the book the question, how is it possible for Christians to naturalize racial vision from within the social logic and theological imagination of Christianity itself? That is, I hear you not saying what happened with the development of race and racial imagination in medieval Christianity forward is not inherent to the brilliance of Christianity itself, but that it was a horrible mistake that got made starting in the 15th century, and it got deeply, deeply embedded in the tradition.
Right.
But I actually hear you saying that Christianity itself actually has a very powerful, different sort of imaginary that can create a different sort of reality or a different sort of world. Am I hearing you correctly?
You are. What we lack, the trajectory that we are in, the problem that we are in, it solidified during the colonial moment from the 15th century forward. But it started with, as I point out in the book, it started with what's known in theological circles as supersessionism. It started with Christians walking away from the dynamic within which their pedagogy was supposed to come to life, their way of educating themselves and their children and their future generations. And that is the dynamic of living inside the story of another people and what it means to learn how to enter in without taking over and without losing oneself.
Being welcomed into Israel,
right,
of another people. Yeah.
And the difficulty is that by the time we get to the colonial moment, what had completely solidified was the obscene, sick reversal of that, so that Christians not only imagine themselves as the chosen elect people of God, they imagined Israel and Jewish people as reprobate, as heretics, and then even worse, as heathen. And that idea of election had worked itself down into the very seeds of what would become nationalism. So an election, an elect people in Portugal, an elect people among the Spanish, an elect people of the German, so all the Europeans understood themselves individually and collectively as Christian nations, elect as nations. And that's the horror of it.
Yeah, and I think probably before having read your book, again, as much as I've kind of tried to do my own critiques of nationalism, I think I would have heard that last thing you said and said, that seems like it's overstating the case. But I'm looking at the stuff that you share about Isaac Watts, for example, the great hymn writer. I had no idea that he had rewritten the Psalms, and he made Britain. He made Great Britain and the kings of Britain the players in the Psalms. I just found that unbelievable that he could do such a thing.
That's right. And the interesting thing about Watts is that he does this while he's writing some of the most powerful, brilliant, beautiful hymns that we sing to this very moment.
Yes.
It's not like that.
They're some of my favorite hymns, and you ruined them for me.
It's not like this was an early phase that he grew out of. No, this was at the very heart of it. And what's so amazing about that, when you read his work, there's not at no point in time did he see this as odd. Not at all. In fact, when you read it, the placement of the nation, precisely in the places where Israel was,
right,
is always at the site of election, always at the site of God is about to do this new thing in the world through, not Israel,
but Britain,
us. So, this is part of the problem.
Yeah, that is just so bizarre. You are listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. We're most grateful to have you joining us. We'd love to hear from you. You may contact us at info@tokensshow.com. And remember, you can find links, photos, books, and related videos from our extensive YouTube channel, all at tokenshow.com/podcast. This is our interview with Dr. Willie James Jennings of Yale University. Coming up, we discuss Christianity, intimacy, and the erotic. Part 2 in just a moment. You are listening to Tokens and our interview with Dr. Willie James Jennings on his book, The Christian Imagination, Theology, and the Origins of Race. In the third move of this book, you talk about intimacy and the erotic.
Yes.
But talk to us a little bit about what this kind of rightful intimacy or rightful erotic means for you.
Yeah. So, and here we come back to, again, what the New Testament gives us. We are Gentiles who have entered the story of another people. And the entering of the story is not just a cognitive entering in. So we come back to the crucial dynamic that's played out in Acts 10 and 11. In my commentary on the book of Acts, I spent time thinking about that because it's important to understand the significance of those two, especially those two chapters for those of us who are Gentile, who've come.
Yeah, and I think you see kind of Acts 10 as kind of one of the central turning points.
Absolutely,
in the book, right?
Because there Peter is, they're on the rooftop, and the passage is really interesting because it says he was waiting for something to be brought to him to eat. He was hungry. He was waiting for something to be brought to him to eat. And at the height of his hunger, while he's waiting for something to be brought to him, that's when the sheet is lowered. And as the story goes, the sheet is filled with things that any pious Jewish person would not touch, either by covenant faithfulness, they would not touch it, or they would be, having been shaped in Jewish faithfulness, they would find it repulsive. I don't want to eat that, but the repulsive thing, the thing that is unholy, unclean, God asked Peter to eat. And then the passage is a struggle. And then, as the story unfolds, but and here what's really crucial for us that I think so many commentators bypass. But if you spend any time reading indigenous writers, then you see exactly the power of it. For so many peoples, to know who they are is to know the animals they eat, the animals they commune with, because they and the animals are one. So if you eat the buffalo, you know what people you are a part of who also eat the buffalo. So, for other animals as well. So when the sheet is lowered, the power of it is that the connection to people is profound, because for Peter, for anyone who understands this, and in his day, of course, this is the way you think about these matters. To see those animals is to see the people that one is then committed to being a part of because you eat their animal.
Right.
So there in Acts 10, the eating of food is to enter into the intimate space of life with another people. And the sheet is filled with food, filled with animals, that Peter understood would be a crisis to his very identity if he consumed them, right? So Acts 10 opens up, he comes to Cornelius' home, you know how the story unfolds. And while Peter's talking, the Spirit falls on the Gentiles, falls on us. And then the words there in Acts 10 are so profound because in all of Acts 10, none of it is what Peter or the disciples want. They're being pushed by the Spirit of God. And so they say, well, I guess we just have to baptize them now. and then in Acts 11 is the most profound part of the story because in Acts 11, Peter returns to his colleagues and the passage says they are furious with him.
Yeah.
And why are they furious? Why did you eat?
Right.
Why did you eat with those Gentiles?
Right.
Because they understood. Remember, at this moment, the followers of Jesus understood themselves to be a renewal movement within Israel, a renewal movement. How can this be a renewal movement when you're eating with Gentiles? And then Peter says, I didn't want to do it. He doesn't defend the Gentiles. He says, I didn't want to do it. God made me go. And the Spirit fell on them. And then the passage says there was silence. And then they rejoiced. So the opening of a life is fundamental to the reality of a Christian. But here in Acts 10 and 11, we see the trajectory of intimacy that is meant for the Christian, right? And of course, the problem is it was thwarted from the very beginning.
Yeah.
We are people who are meant to follow deeply into the gesture of incarnation, not just as a kind of, looking at a model, but this is the participatory reality of life in God that we enter in. And this is the reality of intimacy and the erotic that we have so walked away from. I mean, by the time we come in the New Testament to Jesus is giving us of his body and his blood, what has taken place is the most profound entering in that one could imagine, but that we were not able to imagine. That is, God became incarnate all the way to the ground, all the way to the dirt.
Yeah.
And it's precisely the entering in all the way into the dirt that we have not been able to get our minds around. So there is a level of connection, a level of intimacy that is supposed to characterize the life of the Christian and the nature of Christian community. It's a level of entering in that is the energy, the genius behind boundary and border breaking. So that we should always be about the forming of a radical life together that establishes our communities as places where people have made commitments that shun the power of boundary, that break open the power of border. And unfortunately, we have not been able to catch up with what the Spirit of God has been trying to do in that regard.
I've had one question that I'm ruminating on that I feel makes me a bit vulnerable to pushback, and so feel free if you see some kind of insufficiently considered whiteness saying what I'm about to say.
Well, let me before you ask, let me just say this one thing, because I'm sure some of your listeners will want to have me make clear on this. When I say whiteness, what is that? And I explain it in the book, but it's always important. I always like to help people understand this, because for so many people, they do understand whiteness to be biology, or they understand it to be.
But your point is something much more than that,
culture. Right? And I am at pains to try to help people understand that whiteness is not first phenotype, not first biology, not first culture. Mm-hmm. Whiteness is a way of seeing the world and a way of being seen. Whiteness is a way of being in the world. And it is a way of being that imagines life from the plateau of control, possession, and mastery. Mm. And so it is now here's the difficulty, of course. Whiteness has been formed to be positive. And in fact, for so many people, for generation after generation coming to the West, they came not being white. They came wanting to become white.
Yeah.
That whiteness was an achievement in which one stripped away one's immigrant past and was seeing inside the possibilities of that becoming. That's what's so crucial. Now, and given that, the difficulty is that how do you say to people for whom the achievement of whiteness, that is their ancestors' achievement of whiteness, that they were never privy to the struggle to achieve it. They just basked in the achievement. How do you say to people who have all their lives only understood whiteness to be anything but positive, how to think their existence apart from that whiteness?
Yeah.
And so the difficulty is that something that has always been imagined as naturally who I am, you're asking me now to pull apart and to see as something different. And for so many people, they can't even get their minds around what that would mean. What am I supposed to, what are you asking me to do? And what's necessary is to look at the people of color who surround them, who all their lives have worked to make a distinction, a profound distinction, between the relentless derogatory images and visions and ideas of who they are. If they're African American, African, Asian, Filipino, you name it, that people of color, the negative images to try to pull the reality of who they are from that.
Right.
Recognizing that some elements have been twisted up inside of this, and I have to pull that element out and try to clean it up and say, okay, well, that part is true, but not the way it's been twisted. And so that torturous work that so many people are constantly doing, what has to be said to people who sit comfortably in whiteness, you got to start doing that work now too, recognizing that it's all been so beautifully positive. Why would I want to do it? Anyway, so I need to say that before you go on, because I know for some people they're like, well, what are these guys talking about? I keep saying whiteness. What are they talking about?
Yeah. Well, so with that threefold possession, control, mastery, and following up on that former conversation about intimacy, I lived in a much more diverse world in Alabama than I do in Nashville. Mm-hmm. And my daily life in public school was much more, in our community was much more diverse than my daily life is now. Mm-hmm. But through those experiences, I think one of the things that I look at some of your descriptions there of intimacy and trying to let go of possession, control, and mastery. And it seems to me that, you told a story early in the book about this odd experience between these two white men coming and talking to your mother and inviting them to church, and their complete obliviousness to your mother's faith and the depth of her faith and the beauty of her faith and all sorts. And I'm embarrassed to say, Willie, that I can see myself having done something like that 30 years ago. And I have one memory where I think probably, if I remember it correctly, I think I know a woman who would say, "Yes, Lee, you precisely did that to me when you were a boy." And I meant well, in the ways I could mean well. But I think that what I see is that there's still something in kind of my experience of white Christianity, in which I do have a sort of longing for the sort of intimacy and the sort of embodied. There's something about, I think, and again, forgive me if I'm speaking unhelpfully here, but there's something that's very compelling to me about what I see as Black Christianity in Nashville or Black Christianity in Alabama, that I can see, there's deep beauty in the Christian tradition that I feel like I have missed because I do not have that sort of experience of my Christian practice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how does that strike you? I mean, is that just
no, that makes perfect sense. There should be the recognition that, as I like to say, I always think it's good when people sense that something is not right, something is amiss, and that something that a formation has happened that lacks something. I mean, as you point out, I mean, even as a kid, it struck me as so odd that these guys, it's because I knew how deeply Christian my mother was. I mean, my mother was a super saint. And I knew how deeply Christian she was. And as a little boy, I thought, well, everybody must know that this woman is after Jesus and married, is this Mary? I mean, who would not know my mother? My mother, every Sunday we had a sick list, shut-in list. And every Sunday, my mother and my aunt after church would visit everyone on the sick list and who was shut in. They would go by their homes or go to the hospital. And the pastor oftentimes would say, well, tell my mother and my aunt, I'm tired of these. Why don't you go visit for me. But every Sunday they would visit everyone and pray for them and bring them food. And I thought, as a kid, I'm like, I got to live right because my mama knows God personally. God will wipe me out if I disobey this woman. Because this woman is a saint. But, so when they showed up and they were talking to her like, they didn't, I'm like, what's wrong with these people? But, the recognition that something is amiss, I think is a beautiful thing. The difficulty is that we don't have a way to move from that sense of something being ame to how to imagine life together.
Yeah.
And that's the tragedy. I always say to people who are trying these wonderful multicultural projects that I'm glad they're doing it. The difficulty is that they don't last unless people start with a serious commitment to wanting one another. And it has to be stated just that way. It can't be based on what we think ought to be, what we think is ethically right, what we think is morally good, what we think God wants us to do. All that's true. But what establishes the possibility is the desire for one another. And that desire means I want to hear your voice. And I want to enter into a level of accountability that the very structures of race have thwarted, right? The asymmetrical relationship that exists between people of color and white people in the West is astounding.
Yeah.
And for people to imagine that one can have a relationship without addressing that asymmetrical relationship continues to boggle my mind. I was sitting up talking to a pastor once, and this was back when the current occupant of the White House had just got elected. And folks in his church were leaving. People of color were leaving, especially African Americans were leaving. And he couldn't understand why. And then he told me some of the things he was saying to people. And as I listened to him, I thought, yeah, I would leave too. Because it showed two problems. One, he had never put himself in the position of being a learner with his colleagues in ministry of color or with his congregants. And two, he imagined himself as the adjudicator between the right and the left. And he was somewhere in this beautiful middle, which meant he didn't see himself in the struggles of his own people.
Hmm.
And so as we talked, I thought, man, yeah, they're all going to leave. And, but I always think the right first step is to sense the missing, to sense. But what's also the key here, Lee, and I think this is so true. I always say this when I go to places, that we Christians, we have to understand that the work of the Spirit is always being thwarted by us. When you read the book of Acts, almost everybody is being forced to do what they don't want to do. And the main thing that God is pressing them to do is to go be with people they would prefer not to be.
Yeah.
And that's how we thwart the Spirit. The Spirit is trying to draw us toward others, and we're like, no, I'm not listening. So I do think there's something beautiful about looking and saying, I'm supposed to be inside the logics I'm seeing, and there's something that needs to be happening to me and in me at this moment if I'm going to have the kind of witness,
right,
that God is calling for.
Yeah. I would like to turn to one last thing as we kind of get close to closing. You also talk at one point about the willingness to confront the principality of fear. So what is some of your best pastoral wisdom to yourself or to others in going forward and facing fear and continuing to confront it?
If one yields to the Spirit of God, especially at the sight of racial segregation, racial division, racial comfort in the way the world is, if one yields to the Spirit of God and enters into the way that God wants you to challenge it, what will open up in front of you is what you've always wanted, but that you aren't able to see unless you yield and risk with the Spirit of God. That's what I always say to my students, and I say to everyone, the Spirit of God is the creating Spirit. But the new always waits on the other side of risk. The new is not going to come to you on this side of risk. It waits there. The Spirit is drawing you to the new, but you have to risk the new, to risk to get to the new. And that's brings the challenge.
And that brings us very nicely to where we started with this, your call to being a Christian intellectual, to the risk entailed and the willingness to create and step into the work of creation. So we've been talking to Professor Willie James Jennings of Yale Divinity School on his book, The Christian Imagination. Thank you so much, good professor, for your work, and thank you so much for your time with us today. We're deeply grateful.
Glad to be here.
You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, The Good Life. Thanks so much for joining us. Please remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please remember to refer us to a fellow podcast listener. Got feedback? Well, we'd love to hear from you. Email us, text, or attach a voice memo, and send to the address podcast@tokensshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that make this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg, Bragg Management. Co-producer Jacob Lewis of Great Feeling Studios. Associate producers Ashley Bain and Leslie Eiler Thompson. Our engineer Carrie Harmon. Production assistant Kara Fox. And our live event production team at Stonebrook Media, led by Phil Barnett. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.